Hello and welcome to Newsmakers on CHCH Podcast. I'm Louie Butko. Thank you for joining us on this Tuesday, April 23rd, 2024. And today, former U.S. President Donald Trump was back in a New York City courtroom as his criminal hush money trial continues over alleged payments to Stormy Daniels. And help make sense of the proceedings and the potential impact on the 2024 U.S. presidential race is political science professor and academic director of Wilson College of Leadership and Civic Engagement at McMaster University, Don Abelson. And Don, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
How significant is this Trump trial? I mean, we've heard Trump and trial; those two words go together for about the last 3-4 years. But how significant is what we're witnessing in court this week?
Well, it's incredibly significant. This is the first time in American history that a former president has faced criminal charges. So that in and of itself makes it a significant event. The fact that he's now facing 34 felony counts, having to do not only with hush money to Stormy Daniels, but falsifying business records, makes it a very, very important case to follow. And of course, the timing is critical. We're only months away from the November 2024 U.S. presidential election. And Trump certainly doesn't want to be wasting his time in a courtroom. He wants to be back on the campaign trail. And of course, he's concerned that although he might be able to keep his base together until the next election, he could lose along the way a lot of independent voters who haven't quite made up their minds. So it's very disconcerting for him, and especially because he can exercise virtually no control over this. He can put whatever spin he wants on it, but at the end of the day, he's being treated as any other American citizen should be. Perhaps with the exception of the gag orders, but for the most part being treated as any other person. He's not above the law, and the proceedings will unfold accordingly.
We are living through history with this trial, are we not?
We absolutely are. And when you piece it together, when you go back to look at all the different civil trials that have taken place over the last number of years, this is not an accident. This is a well-established pattern. And so for New York State to come forward with a case like this, they have to make sure that their evidence is very, very strong, that Trump intentionally used money that was funneled through his former lawyer, Michael Cohen, to keep his alleged affair or alleged encounter with Stormy Daniels private, so it wouldn't hurt him in the 2016 presidential election. And then if you add to that all the allegations around falsifying records in the Trump organization, the evidence continues to mount.
You mentioned Michael Cohen. He's expected to testify. The prosecution expecting him to be a key witness in this, and the defense is going to try to test his credibility. Right. But it's worth pointing out that Michael Cohen has served jail time for this case, and that Trump was named in that as co-conspirator number one.
Absolutely. So, Michael Cohen has been on a campaign over the last several years to redeem himself. Probably no one knew as much about the inner workings of the Trump organization as Cohen did. And if you go back to the footage of Cohen before he was caught in this mess, no one could have been a stronger proponent for Donald Trump. So the fact that he has come clean, he has served jail time. And he was the one, after all, who provided the hush money to Stormy Daniels, $130,000, and then was reimbursed through the Trump organization. So the fact of the matter is, Donald Trump can maintain the story that he had nothing to do with Stormy Daniels, that the money that was given to Michael Cohen was for legal expenses. But at the end of the day, you'd have to be living on a different planet to buy the narrative that he's shaped around this.
The defense hasn't said if they intend to call anyone to testify other than the former president himself. He has said multiple occasions, probably as early as today, definitely yesterday, that he intends to testify. What percentage of chance, Professor, do you see Donald Trump, former U.S. president, taking that stand in this case?
Generally, if someone like Trump were to take the stand, you know that they're already guilty. And so this is kind of like a Hail Mary. And the problem with Trump is he can't control his voice. He can't control what he says. And his lawyers have tried to do that from day one. But what this case reminds me of is going back to the Clinton years during the Clinton and Lewinsky scandal. And everything fell apart after Clinton promised the American public that he had nothing to do with the White House intern. And when she was able to provide a rather considerable detail, let's say, about his body parts, that's when he caved. Because unless you were involved in an intimate relationship with him, you wouldn't have known that. I could see something like that coming up, during the trial. So Trump can deny it all he wants, but at the end of the day, I think there's going to be more evidence that paints him into a corner. Whether he testifies or not, we'll have to wait and see. But he's not the type of client you want on the stand.
We've heard that a lot. And there's been some reporting that, Trump may actually be more afraid of Karen McDougal or even David Pecker, who's testifying, continuing to testify today, Hope Hicks, people who were close to him. And you mentioned Michael Cohen. Yeah. You've seen this president. You've seen him come down that golden escalator. I remember sitting in a newsroom in Kelowna, watching on a computer, him come down the escalator, him make that speech and just think, well, there's no way this is going to happen. It's happened. How do you make sense of, especially going into 2024, the fealty to Donald Trump, the Bill Barrs who can come out, Attorney General worked with him, all these people, Michael Cohen especially, his fixer, who can come out and say, there's just something about him. There's just something about him. There is a fealty to Donald Trump.
There is, and over time he's been able to develop this cult-like personality. What people admired about Trump was that he was able to really play the easiest card in politics, which is play to the fears and anxiety and concerns of the electorate. He gave millions of people permission to remove their filters. He gave millions of people permission to say whatever was on their minds and that there wouldn't be any retribution. This notion that he wasn't part of the elite, he was attacking the elite, of course he was part of the elite and has been his entire life. But his message resonated, obviously, with millions and millions of Americans who have felt increasingly disillusioned and disenfranchised, angry and bitter with the way Washington politics continues to unfold. But keep in mind, too, a lot of pundits in 2016 had written him off. But the reality is his election didn't happen by accident. The American people, the United States, had to be ready for a candidate like Trump to come along. So, the environment was in place. He was the right candidate at the right time. He really served as a channel or a conduit through which millions could vent their anger. And for me, what's terribly surprising is not only was he able to achieve that in the 4 years he was in office, but for the years he was out of office. Yeah. In my entire career and in my reading of American political history, I have never seen a president who has been able to maintain and exercise the kind of political control he has over the Republican Party. Never seen that.
I think of January 6th, obviously, but I think of January 7th, and I think of Lindsey Graham going on the Senate floor, and that's it, I'm done, like that. And then 2 weeks later, McCarthy going down there. Kevin McCarthy, right. the ousted speaker by his own party. Kevin McCarthy going down to Mar-a-Lago, kissing the ring. And even today, Governor Chris Sununu in New Hampshire, who campaigned hard for Nikki Haley, who said Nikki Haley is the only choice. And then last week was on one of those Sunday morning shows and was pressed by George Stephanopoulos, who said, "You have said he is a danger to the country. You have said he committed criminal acts on January 6th. Why are you voting?" Well, it's me and 52% of the population. Like, that's not a real argument as to why you support. Right. And again, I go back to that. Is this just all about power for Republicans, do you feel?
It is. Politics is about acquiring power, consolidating it, and holding on to it. And people in the Republican Party know that Trump still wields considerable power and influence. It's about political expediency. At the end of the day, they want to hold on to their own jobs. Republicans in the House and the Senate don't wake up every morning and salute a picture of Donald Trump. But they're thinking about their own political careers and what is the best way to hold on to them. So it's all about loyalty so far as they can extract important political concessions. And that's why it takes so much courage for or it has taken so much courage for a handful of people, like a Liz Cheney, to come out and speak against Trump. If John McCain were still alive, you can just imagine the kinds of things he would be saying about Donald Trump. But unfortunately, those people are few and far between. And the bulk of the Republican Party is Donald Trump's party. We've known that now for years.
You brought up Liz Cheney. She had an op-ed piece in the New York Times this week about the Supreme Court, which is hearing the presidential immunity, they're hearing arguments this week. The Supreme Court will consider the question whether a president is immune from criminal prosecution.
Right.
This seems, again, we talked about the trial itself being a historic moment. Here is a Supreme Court which is very much right-leaning control, which has 3 members appointed by this past president. How significant is this case that's being heard by the Supreme Court?
It's incredibly significant. The Supreme Court in the United States, the only court required by the framers of the Constitution. All other federal courts are creations of Congress. The Supreme Court is the last court of appeal, and so is very, very significant. I think the American people should be deeply concerned if a decision comes down granting the president immunity. The interesting thing about the case taking place in Manhattan, though, is because it was launched by the state, even if, fast forward to 2024 and Donald Trump wins, all this discussion around, well, he's going to pardon himself, which has never happened before. That's unprecedented. But let's suppose he has the ability to pardon himself. He cannot pardon himself in a state matter, only for federal offenses. So it's going to be very interesting. And the other point that you raise is spot on. It is so important for U.S. presidents to have these vacancies come up on the U.S. Supreme Court. They know from the time they enter the Oval Office that they will be in power for either 4 or 8 years. Their lasting legacy is what they can do on the court. And that's why those 3 appointments were so critical to Trump, because even when his power wanes, the power and reach of the court continues well after he has left politics. So it's very significant.
Well, and we saw Mitch McConnell in 2016 say, well, there's no way we can appoint a Supreme Court justice in an election year in 2020, deciding after Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away that that rule can be changed. And the thing about the Supreme Court, you put young people on and they're going to stick around forever. Trump, I think the average age was about 40 to 50 in terms of the people that he put on the court. That case is obviously going to be something to watch because it's affecting the January 6th case that Jack Smith has brought. That's one of the trials that Trump could potentially in 2024, November, whatever, January 1st, he can say, we don't want this anymore. Sorry, Jack Smith, you're dismissed, right?
That's correct. Absolutely. And so, I mean, when you go back to the founding of the American Republic, this whole notion that anyone is above the law, ultra vires, above the law, simply can't hold. It is completely inconsistent with the history of the United States. I've often said that, Donald Trump didn't want to be president. He wanted to be king. Well, America had a king, and things didn't work out that well. Led, obviously, to the American Revolution. Somehow, the United States has to find its moral compass. It's lost it. And the entire political scene now is simply seen through the lens of left and right, not right and wrong. And the fear is that if you have someone like Trump return to power, someone who has already expressed his support for autocrats around the world, leading the greatest democracy, on the planet, people should be very concerned. And when Hillary Clinton said, he's simply not, well suited or equipped to be president, or temperamentally fit. She was right. How many people do you need to come out and talk about his political psyche and his makeup and his narcissism and everything else for it to begin to resonate? So this shouldn't be about politics. This should be about the person occupying the most powerful position in the world.
So as a political scientist, as someone who has dedicated your life to studying how people get into power, how people keep power, how do you make sense of in American politics, which for since its founding has said we are a nation without a king, law is king. I think it was Thomas Paine who wrote that. The law is king. How did we get from there with our founding fathers? As a political scientist, how can you explain how we got from there to Trump now?
Again, the comment I made before that, Trump's election didn't happen by accident. Mm-hmm. If you look back, even in modern political history, the past 20, 25 years, it's so interesting that Trump always invokes Ronald Reagan's name, right? Let's make America great again. That was Reagan's slogan in 1980. Reagan and Trump shared very, very little in common. The types of Republicans that existed during his terms in office and George H.W. Bush's term in office were very different. The Republican Party had always been known as the party of principle, the party of law and order, the party that abided by and respected the U.S. Constitution. Fast forward, you saw the emergence of the Tea Party, taxed enough already. You began to see the Republican Party move more and more to the right, to the point that they began to embrace candidates who believed in conspiracy theories, people, again, who felt very comfortable, whether it was in Congress or even in the White House, saying whatever they wanted without fear of retribution. So this isn't a process that's happened overnight. I would say, the focus has really been on the last 20 to 25 years. And if you look at the electoral map of the United States, and I often tell my students before a U.S. presidential year, look at the map. It's no coincidence that the middle of the country is bright red and the coasts are blue. That has not changed over the last 5 to 6 elections. So it's a very polarized country, which has become increasingly toxic. It is a country where there is rising distrust in public officials, appointed and elected. And the United States is at a very, very dangerous crossroads in its history. Mm-hmm. So I've always said to people, we can talk about immigration, we can talk about healthcare, we can talk about foreign policy and gun control. And in this country, at least, knock on wood, we can still have a civil exchange. Those days are long over in the United States. Unless the issue is framed in a way that aligns with the principles of your political party, you are considered persona non grata.
It's pretty incredible in the U.S. because when you look at the Senate, we're at a 51-49 split or we're not 50-50, 51-49 split in the U.S. Senate. You look at the House of Representatives right now with some Republican departures. I believe it's about 4 seats. Their polling averages at 40-45%. It is incredible to be this polarized so equally in this country, in that country.
Absolutely. Again, go back to the Reagan years. He obviously won in 1980, defeated Jimmy Carter. In 1984, Reagan won among the greatest landslides in American political history. He won all but one electoral college state, right? Lost the state of Minnesota to Walter Mondale. Mondale picked up 3 additional electoral votes through the District of Columbia, which obviously is not a state. He won 49 states. Fast forward, we're in a period that we know it'll be 1 or 2 states that determine the outcome of the presidential election. We could talk about 2000, Bush versus Gore, but really it has been over the last 20 years, 22 years, that things have become completely unhinged. And that's what keeps many qualified people away and discouraged from participating in politics. And certainly that's something we're trying to achieve at McMaster.
It can come down to 1 or 2 states. And within those states, you look at Wisconsin. Wisconsin can come down to
a couple counties.
A couple of votes. Really, these are votes, 400 votes. And, Trump can say he won the popular vote. That's just factually incorrect in both 2020 2020 and 2016. Right. People don't like to listen to facts. I mean, because I'm looking here. 26% of respondents, this is Real Clear Politics, they're a polling aggregator. Polling averages currently give Trump a slight edge.
Right.
But more importantly than, that head-to-head, it's the battleground states. And you mentioned that. And Trump is leading in 6 of the 7 that Real Clear Politics tracks. But this was the number that stood out to me. Biden, obviously, minus 15% disapproval rating, or minus 40% approval rating. 26% of respondents in their polling averages say the country's heading in the right direction. That seems to be what it always comes down to. And you and I were just talking, Biden probably missed an opportunity for the Democrats to do really well in 2024. What did you mean by that?
I think he really did. I mean, let's go back to 2020 and how Biden was elected. The Democratic Party establishment was deeply concerned when Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, was doing incredibly well in the early Democratic primaries. And they felt, the party establishment did, that if Sanders ended up being the Democratic presidential nominee, you may as well give Trump the keys back to the White House, because there's no way he was going to be able to defeat Trump. So they rallied around Biden just before the South Carolina primaries, and that's when things began to change in favor of Biden. What I think he should have done, winning in 2020, given his age, and the fact that clearly there's some issues going on, he should have announced very early on that he would be a one-term president. And that would have given the Democratic Party, I think, an opportunity to hit the reset button. There's some very qualified people in the party, but he didn't do that. He convinced himself along the way that he was the only one capable of defeating Trump, and I think that's a big mistake. Of course, we're going to have to see what pans out in 2024, but I think he should have given younger people in his party, and Kamala Harris certainly could have thrown her hat into the ring, an opportunity to hit the reset button and figure out the way ahead for that party.
And we saw Gavin Newsom hanging around the California governor. He was kind of doing debates when he could. He debated DeSantis a few months ago as well, when DeSantis was still. DeSantis is an interesting character too. What did you make of his presidential campaign? And again, after all this name calling and everything else, it all goes back to, I'm going to support Donald Trump for president again.
Right, because they realize that their political careers, at least in the foreseeable future, depend on Trump giving, in this case, DeSantis his blessing. So I thought DeSantis very early on in the campaign, was building some momentum, not always consistent, but some momentum, had a fairly decent record as governor of Florida. I thought Nikki Haley had done well in the primaries. Of course, she was the last person standing. But you're not going against a person. You're going against an entire political machine. And Trump just had a massive campaign chest, war chest, shortly after he left office. He was able to, with few exceptions, maintain considerable support in large financial networks, and that's very, very difficult to compete against.
It's also difficult to compete against somebody who doesn't play by the rules, and whether it's just the legal rules, as we're finding out right now with these criminal trials, but even just the general agreed upon rules of politics, just common courtesy sometimes is how people would define it. It's hard to fight somebody who fights dirty, and that's exactly what Trump does, is it not?
Well, he fights terribly dirty, and it's like Jon Stewart, often said, you can't negotiate with crazy. He sees himself as being uniquely privileged, that the laws apply to everyone but him. And again, setting aside politics, just focusing on personality. The fact that you have a grown man who has to resort to name calling in politics is just appalling. But that's who he is. He kind of reminded me of the Holiday Inn ad, right? The best surprise is no surprise. Believe him when he says something, because that's what he is going to do.
Yeah.
But what's remarkable is that the public is so willing to accept it and endorse it and embrace it. That's what's disturbing.
There's somebody, I think it's John Heilman, who always says, watch what he says, because it's either a projection or an admission.
Right.
It's either, I didn't do this, you did this. And we see it now. He's coming out, political interference. This is political interference. These trials are political interference, right? Let's talk about what happened this past weekend. The U.S. House of Representatives hoping this weekend for the Senate to pass a series of aid bills.
Right.
Mike Johnson was facing turmoil within his own party. He still is. Marjorie Taylor Greene is saying, you've lost MAGA. You've lost the MAGA movement because of this. How significant was Mike Johnson's leadership this past weekend, and does he deserve credit for finally getting these series of aid packages passed?
I think he does deserve some credit. You'll recall what a mess it was just trying to elect a Speaker of the House.
The first time, though.
Yeah, I know.
The first, we should have known when it took 16 votes, however many votes it took to get Kevin McCarthy in the first place.
Right.
This wasn't going to be a typical Congress.
It was not going to be a typical Congress. So, I think he does deserve some credit for what he did. But what the Republican Party really needs is more leadership, not followers, leaders. People who have the capacity to, focus on the country and not on themselves. And politics should be about serving the public's interests, not your own narrowly defined parochial interests. So for Johnson really to impress me, there's got to be a lot more of it, and he has to be prepared, again, not to see the world through left and right, but right and wrong. And I think there are people in the Republican Party who privately feel the same way, but they're not prepared at this point to put their necks out, especially during an election year.
I mean, you mentioned Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, obviously on the House side as well. How worried are you? You mentioned here in Canada, we aren't as polarized, but how worried are you about the Americanization of Canadian politics? Is it something that you feel we should be on the lookout for?
I do. I absolutely do. We have to remain vigilant. I had an opportunity for the last 5 years to work closely with Brian Mulroney when I headed up his institute at St. X. And regardless of what people thought about him, he passed along a lot of very interesting leadership tips. And the more you got to know him, the more you realized that, for him, of course, politics was important. His friendships that he made throughout politics were even more important. And that kind of civility, even though, listen, millions of Canadians were divided over the GST and Meech Lake and Charlottetown, two of his greatest regrets, not bringing Quebec back into the constitutional fold. But that kind of civility with foreign leaders and with his own political foes is missing. And what worries me, when we see, Trudeau now and Poilievre and, the kind of discussions that they're having, you have to focus on the issues. You've got to keep the personalities out of it, because Canadians deserve an opportunity to be able to cast a vote for the person, the party they feel will best represent their interests.
Let's go back to the U.S. side, 2024, November. I mean, every time I look at the calendar and I'm like, oh, it's April. Like, November is coming very quickly. Second Tuesday in November, as it is every 4 years, there's a presidential election. What do you think? What are you going to be looking for? Obviously, these criminal trials, Supreme Court this week, like that ruling. First of all, I would take the Supreme Court overruling an appellate court, superior court, right? This would be unprecedented to turn it over. But what are you going to be looking for in the next few months going into November? And even, we have to ask the question past November. We know what happened last time Trump lost. What are you going to be looking at for the next few months?
Well, a lot of the things that you've just mentioned, obviously updates on the trials, whether or not there'll even be a conclusion to the trial in New York before the election takes place. I will be looking at whether or not, Biden is able to generate more voter support. The Democrats tend to do much better when there's huge voter turnout. They don't do as well when people decide to stay at home and sit on the couch. He cannot afford to go through the kind of election that Hillary Clinton did in 2016. Hillary Clinton, ignored some solid states, Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, others. She thought they were a given. They weren't. So, I'll be looking for signals that, people are becoming more animated and more energized. But one thing we haven't talked about is the fact that we have someone who not only served as president, but is looking for to be only the second president in American history who could conceivably win a non-consecutive term. This goes back to 1896 with Grover Cleveland. But when asked, will he accept the results of the election, he gives the same response. We'll see. It depends.
Yeah.
Gore didn't put up that kind of fight in the state of Florida in 2000. When the court ruled, he capitulated. Yeah. So am I looking for pushback? Of course. I'm concerned deeply about violence during and after the election. And I'm concerned that if it is a razor-thin victory on either side, there'll be tremendous political fallout. So it's all those things that I think we have to consider in watching the election, and whether there'll be debates or not. Which
is so atypical.
I know.
I mean, which is so we're having a discussion on whether or not two presidential candidates will actually debate.
Right.
And it is a question because we've changed the rules that the front runner of the Republican Party at no point had to debate. Everybody went on stage without him, but he was still the biggest story. He's not there.
Right.
That makes it the biggest story, and it makes it such an unprecedented election, obviously, for so many reasons. But we started this conversation with this trial, living through history. How do we as citizens, especially here in Canada, how do we as citizens take it all in? How do we learn? What do we hope? What lessons can we learn from it? Because it's history for sure, and it's going to be taught in textbooks for decades to come. So what should we be taking out of it as ordinary citizens?
I think what we need to learn and appreciate is how privileged we are living in a country that allows us to engage in free expression without fear of retribution. Now, of course, there are conflicts going on around the world, and people, unfortunately, are feeling targeted and displaced. But for the most part, you can still engage in civil discourse in this country. We should feel very privileged that we have the vote. We should feel very privileged that we can have members of our family who are aligned with a different political party, but they're still more than welcome to come to dinner. And we should understand how quickly things can change. I don't think there are many people who would have predicted, when Reagan was president in 1980 and 1984, before he became ill, that the United States would move in this direction. So it's a cautionary tale for us. It's a cautionary tale about doing our very best to protect democratic institutions and processes, for citizens to become engaged, to become more knowledgeable about the process, and to step up and step forward and decide that they will run for office. We need young leaders who are creative and imaginative and thoughtful and have the capacity to think outside the box. We need leaders who have that kind of courage, and they want to make Canada a better place because they want to make their communities a better place. And so I'm hopeful, although hope is never a strategy, but let's say I'm optimistic that there is a silver lining in all of this. And I think it's going to remind those of us who live north of the border that it doesn't take a whole lot for things to unravel. And we need to remain vigilant and careful and make sure that we engage actively as citizens in a country that has been so good to us. We need to give back.
Very well put. Don, before we let you go, I got to ask you, I saved the toughest question for last. London Knights are coming off a big sweep of the Kitchener Knights, I believe, or Kitchener Rangers. Kitchener Rangers. The London Knights coming off the sweep. Is this their year? It seems like every year is possibly their year, but is this the year for the London Knights?
Well, I can tell you as a season ticket holder of the London Knights for many years, I really didn't think the makeup of the team was that strong at the beginning of the season. But I am a big fan of Dale Hunter and the management, and they've come along really, really nicely. And so the third series is going to be interesting. They've got some very talented people. The fans come out in droves. And I think they have a very, very good shot. So long as Michael Simpson in goal is on top of his game, he will give his players a chance to win every night.
Very few better atmospheres in junior hockey than the Gardens on a playoff day.
It's absolutely phenomenal. I mean, those kids, and they're kids, are really treated like NHL players. London is a wonderful city for sports. It has supported the London Knights, since they were established back in the 1960s. And Dale and Mark Hunter and Basil McRae have done an absolutely amazing job with that team. And when you think of the number of players that have graduated from the Knights and have gone on to have successful NHL careers, it's not surprising that young people fight so hard just for a spot on that team.
Don, appreciate your OHL insights. Appreciate your U.S. politics. I know you're the expert on the U.S. politics, so I appreciate your insights as well. Great conversation. Thank you for joining me.
Louie, thank you so much.
Donald Abelson, professor at McMaster University of Political Science. My thanks to him for joining me. My thanks to Chantel Grillo for directing today's show, and my thanks to you for joining us. Make sure you like and subscribe to CHCH Podcast so you never miss an episode of this show or any of the other shows we have for you. One more time, thank you so much for joining us. From all of us here at CHCH, I'm Louie Butko. Have a great day.